Mr Ward.
My lady, our next witness today is Dr. Chris Hall.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Thanks. Doctor, we hope we didn't interrupt your lunch by having a slightly different lunch break.
Not at all, lady.
Would you state your full name for the inquiry, please?
I'm Christopher Hall, but I'd prefer if you called me Chris, if that's possible.
I will probably resort to Mr. Hall or Dr. Hall, whichever you prefer.
As you wish.
Dr. Hall, we're grateful to you for the provision of two statements. Inquiry document 000536-369 and inquiry 000536-421, both of which have been signed by you. Can you confirm, please, that they are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm that.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I start with a number of preliminary questions about your background, Dr. Hall? You joined the Cabinet Office on secondment, did you not, in September of 2012?
Yes.
And you worked for the GCCO, the Government Commercial...
The Chief Commercial Officer, yes.
Chief Commercial Officer. When that secondment ended, you joined the Civil Service in the spring of 2014 as a Deputy Director, leading the complex transactions team.
Yes.
Yeah. Prior to joining the Cabinet Office, you were the practice lead for IT sourcing in Ernst & Young's advisory unit.
Yes.
Yeah. And you, at that point, had accumulated a very significant amount of experience in the IT industry. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
In fact, something in the order of 30 years.
I'm sorry, I'm older than I look.
Well, it wasn't for that reason that I made the point. I will be asking you some questions about data and IT handling, and it's relevant for that purpose to know that you have had that experience.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And in addition to that, in common with some of the other witnesses that have given evidence in the course of this inquiry, you have quite a lot of public sector experience.
Indeed. Starting when I worked for IT companies, selling to the public sector, and then as a management consultant, working for public sector entities, particularly on procurement projects.
Thank you. From about the 20th of April of 2020, you took on a wider managerial role as part of the management team of the PPE buy cell, and you were the most senior Cabinet Office commercial representative within that team.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. In fact, you worked as Mr. Rhys-Williams' deputy until July 2020, did you not?
Yes.
And you have retired between then and now. You were retired in June 2022.
That's correct.
Thank you. Rather like Mr. Cairnduff, who gave evidence earlier today, you had a relatively short, but no doubt very intense period within the PPE buy cell.
Yes, that's correct.
That period ran, it's a little longer than Mr. Cairnduff's, from the 2nd of April of 2020 until the 30th of June of 2020.
It's actually a little bit shorter than Mr. Cairnduff's, but your dates are correct.
Your experience within the VIP lane, let's just situate ourselves within that entity. It is, the VIP lane was made up of civil servants and volunteers from across the government, yes?
Correct.
Yeah. There were a small number of consultants and there were caseworkers working from home in the main.
As was I.
As was more or less everybody at that point.
Yes.
Each department had its own IT systems, is that right?
That's correct.
Which we'll come back to, but there was, in order to communicate, video conferencing and file sharing, which were difficult to manage at that time, weren't they?
Yes.
Yeah. Information exchange was a challenge, to say the least.
Yes, among other challenges, yes.
Those involved in the VIP lane resorted to very large spreadsheets. We saw an example of that earlier today. And there were no live documents, were there?
You mean shared documents? Or?
Documents with shared documents which could be updated periodically by whoever was in that document or inputting data into those documents.
That's right, because we couldn't share those outside of departmental systems.
Yeah, because of a siloing effect of each department having its own systems.
And different technology, yes.
And different technologies. At this point, Mendix had not yet been introduced.
That's correct.
How much of a step forward was Mendix when it arrived?
Enormous.
Yeah, please tell us why.
So Mendix was a single, I believe, cloud-based system, which most of the people inside the PPE buy-sell could access. Sort of hackneyed phrase, which is the single version of the truth. But that's in many cases what it represented. So if you wanted to find out the status of a particular offer, what a particular offer consisted of, then that data was consistent and was held in Mendix once, rather than being in many different places, in different people's private storage areas, or indeed in these multiple spreadsheets that you were referring to earlier.
So before the introduction of Mendix, most caseworkers had very limited information with which to work, including whether targets were being met or not.
I think that's more of a communications issue than a data issue. And it was, for whatever reason, certain information was limited in circulation.
Well, whatever the reason, did that itself have an impact on morale and efficiency?
Speaking as a caseworker at the time, it had an effect on my morale and my efficiency, yes.
Yeah, all right. You were allocated cases by Mr. Canduff, weren't you?
Yes.
And in fact, he wanted you to handle what he describes as the most difficult cases.
Yes.
And by that, he meant those with the biggest stakeholder implications, we're told.
By and large, yes.
So putting it in terms of the VIP lane, we're talking about those that were referring offers into the VIP lane that expected responses to demands for feedback.
Yes.
Yeah. Why is it that it was you that was asked to handle those most difficult of cases?
If my lady would permit, I just want to go back a little tiny bit and explain my personal situation. So why was I, as a director in SES2, working as a caseworker alongside more junior staff in the front line of this particular enterprise?
Please do.
I was about to retire. So when COVID hit, I was about to retire for about the third time. And my successor as Deputy Chief Commercial Officer had already been appointed, and I was cutting down my hours. I was working 2 days a week, and I was on a glide path to what I saw as a long and happy retirement, tending my garden and indulging myself in my many hobbies. When COVID hit, I was away from the Cabinet Office. I wasn't in the office physically. I actually went to live with my mother in Derbyshire because she was approaching 90, and I thought that was the only way to keep us safe. So I'm remote physically and to a certain extent organisationally from what might be considered my normal duties in the Cabinet Office. And after a couple of weeks doing that, I saw, receiving regular bulletins about what my colleagues were doing, I saw that there was a grave need for people with my skill set and that I could make a serious contribution to what was going on. And as a consequence, I volunteered to come and work anywhere in the COVID-19 procurement effort. And I spoke to Jeanette, who was the manager of the complex transactions team at the time, and she allocated me. She said, "There's a job here, working for Max, in this PPE buy-sell. It would suit your skill set. Max is looking for somebody who is used to dealing with ministers, who's used to handling C-suite executives from outside corporations, and who's got the kind of network that you've got.
Understood, and thank you for that explanation and background of how it came to be that you were working where you did work. You were allocated the most politically sensitive cases.
In Max's description, yes.
Yes. And we see from your witness statement, you say, to my mind, these were the offers which had the potential to cause reputational damage for the programme and to undermine public confidence if not handled appropriately.
Certainly some of them are in that category, yes.
And you're referring there to cases within the VIP lane?
All the cases I saw were within the high priority lane, yes.
Yeah. There's a certain irony there, isn't there, that you, at the outset, were concerned about the possibility that the handling of those cases would cause reputational damage. You're aware, of course, that the high priority lane itself caused a degree of reputational damage.
Yes, which I regret.
Yeah. Should that handling of reputational damage be a task that is taken up by yourself or by your colleagues in a time of crisis or emergency?
I think that's quite a complex question to think about. I think it's possibly naive to think that these programs exist outside of a political context. And the whole issue of the handling of the pandemic was the subject of intense media attention and, of course, occupied many politicians for many hours and was a very intense period for the politicians as it was for the officials. Part of the job, I believe, was to maintain public confidence that the government could answer this particular challenge, could answer the challenge of setting up a test network that would adequately test people for the disease, that would keep people safe, buying the vaccines, and also the very, very important job of obtaining enough PPE for health and social care workers.
Well, let me put the question a slightly different way in that case. In an ideal world, one wouldn't be coping or managing that noise or that distraction. One would focus instead on the fundamental task of procuring as much as was needed and as effectively as possible.
In an ideal world, yes, you would.
Yeah.
But we were not in an ideal world.
Particularly given, as you recount in some detail in your evidence, the volume of work and the stresses and the strains that were caused by that. You say that you yourself processed 40 cases in parallel.
Yes, but others process more.
Others processed more. Your own recollection is that that volume of work was extremely demanding. You used a Trello board. Can you explain what that is?
I'm sorry, it's a bit of jargon. It's a networked available, an internet available tool for handling information, and it's the equivalent of an electronic pin board. So you can put little notes saying, I've called Mr. So-and-so on this particular date and done this with him, and I can organise that pin board so I can use it as a brought forward file.
Thank you. You tell us that following up a single lead could require dozens of telephone calls and emails.
Yes.
That's within the VIP lane, yes?
Yes.
Do you know what the experience was outside of the VIP lane? Are you able to compare the two?
Not directly, but I can't imagine it's very different.
You think that a single lead might have required dozens of telephone calls and emails?
Yes.
At one point, you tell us that you were sending an email every 2 minutes, either to a prospective supplier or to a colleague to try to progress an order.
Yes.
And in between those emails, presumably you were processing, considering other emails. There was work to be done in between.
Yes.
Yeah. On top of all of that, threats were made, weren't they? You tell us that it was quite common for suppliers to threaten that they would escalate their grievances to the press or to senior figures within government.
not uncommon, I would say. Not
Again,
uncommon.
do you say that that is an experience that was not uncommon within the VIP lane and elsewhere?
I can't speak for elsewhere.
You can't. And in the answer you gave earlier, you couldn't speak for elsewhere either. How much direct involvement did you have with non-VIP lane offers?
I did not have much involvement at the time, but as your colleagues might know, I've spent the last year and a half gathering evidence for the inquiry, and I've had access to very, very many documents.
Even that exercise, tell me if I'm wrong here, it does not enable you to draw, make a comparative analysis between the intensity of communications necessary within the high priority lane and outside of the high priority lane.
I can get some measure of the intensity by talking to people like Darren Blackburn, who was in here earlier, who did have that experience.
Have you done so?
I have talked to Darren many times about that.
And did you find that there was a roughly equivalent amount of need to feed back in both of those processes?
The need was to communicate with the supplier to get the offer to a point where we could actually process it sensibly.
Well, in the case of non-VIP lane offers, it's the supplier. In the case of VIP lane offers, it's often the referrer, isn't it?
Okay, I understand the distinction. So the amount of communication with the supplier, I would estimate, was comparable, but the non-VIP lane caseworkers, the non-HPL caseworkers, did not have to communicate with a third party, the referrer, about the progress of offers.
And that does make sense, doesn't it? Because if you're getting close to concluding a contract, you may need to communicate directly with the supplier. But in the earlier stages of the process, that may not be necessary or so necessary.
Well, I believe that other witnesses have explained to you the broad process for concluding contracts. So the opportunities teams, of which the HPL team was one, is just the first step, the initial step in that process. So, and I know Mr. Blackburn talked to you about this morning. Then there's a handover to technical assurance. Technical assurance check the documentation to do with the product. Often technical assurance hand back and say, this is missing, that's missing, this doesn't look quite right, which provokes the opportunities caseworker to have further discussions with the supplier to try and fill the gaps.
So I am focused on referrers now, and it's in relation to those that you say in your witness statement. Ultimately, many of these complaints, we're now talking about complaints made by referrers whose offer had not received a response or who were wondering what had happened with it, for example, would be referred back to the HPL mailbox by the official or minister who had received the complaint. This simply added to our existing workload and required time to investigate and to explain to hard-pressed ministers what had in fact happened and why the offer had not proceeded further.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I'll just go back to my previous answer, which I didn't manage to complete, forgive me. So you talk about talking to suppliers when you're getting close to contract. That was somebody else's job. That was the job of the closing team. It wasn't the job of the people in the HPL team.
All right. Could we display, please, INQ 000527527 557? So it's this page I wanted to look at, but it follows on from a string of emails with which you may be familiar between yourself and Alan Nixon.
Yep.
In which you set out in a page-long email many of the stresses and strains that you're experiencing as a result of various matters, including threats for those that have referred in offers to the high priority lane to go to the press. Here specifically, someone had threatened to go to Piers Morgan with the story, and there are a list of other matters. And Alan Nixon, who is Alan Nixon?
Alan was a special advisor to Matt Hancock.
Okay. And Alan Nixon says, we will keep trying to insulate you and your team from things like this unless absolutely necessary. Problem was, this one came direct from Matt, presumably Matt Hancock. and he'd asked for an answer on it. I've spoken to him and he's happy, as is the MP. So this sort of email would certainly have caused you and whoever else it might be that received a similar email to leave to one side whatever they were working on and to prioritise handling this sort of concern first. Is that right?
That's true. And if I can, I'll give another example. So in late April 2020, the then Shadow Minister to the Cabinet Office, Rachel Reeves, wrote to Michael Gove saying, here's 20 companies, I don't think they've been contacted. At that point, I and others had to do a lot of research to understand what had indeed happened with these companies and to assure Minister Gove that some had been contacted, some had not been contacted, but in any event, we thought there was one useful lead amongst the 20, and help Michael Gove's private office formulate a response for Rachel Reeves.
Understood.
Which was a lot of work.
Of course.
But it's an appropriate thing to do because that's how the parliamentary process works.
With hindsight, might it have been preferable that if it was necessary to do that, if one couldn't simply ask such requests or such individuals requesting updates, to hold off until the offers had been properly considered, for others to be engaged in that task, others who were not directly involved in the procurement exercise?
To a certain extent, but senior commercial officials help answer parliamentary questions, FOI requests and other requests all the time. It's a normal part of the job. Yeah? And if you have a third party who's a different official without necessarily the background or the technical knowledge preparing an answer like that, they're going to take longer and they're just going to ask you a lot of questions. So in many cases, it's quicker to do the work yourself.
There was, of course, in due course, a rapid response team
Yes.
that handled offers in a different way, that hadn't come in from VIPs. Is that not a way of avoiding the burden, the noise, the distraction?
That's an interesting hypothesis, but I originated the rapid response teams, so I've got a slightly different view, if I might explain. So the rapid response teams were there to do the processing side. They weren't there to do the tell the referrer what's going on with this offer. They're there to process an offer as quickly as possible from inception through to the point where a contract can be formed and passed to the accounting officer for consideration. Those offers came from the high priority lane team as well as the non-high priority lane team.
Yes.
So the only consideration about going into the rapid response team process was that it was a good, viable offer that we thought we could process quickly.
With no regard to who had referred it in, if it hadn't come in through the VIP route?
No, purely on this one's good to cook. This is ready to go. We can execute this quickly. The handling back to the referrer, if at all necessary, would have been handled by somebody in the high priority lane team.
But Dr. Hall, you were the originator of the rapid response
Yes.
team process. It sounds from what you and others have said that it was a process that might have obviated the need for the VIP lane, given that there was no shortage of offers already coming in, and we'll come on to the call for arms and the effect that had, with an efficient method of triage. And with your IT experience, you may have ideas of how one might achieve that efficiency. Mm-hmm. But isn't there, between the rapid response team and live data with offers providing all the necessary elements of an offer to be considered up front, a method of just not having a VIP lane at all?
No, I'm afraid that's not the case.
Well, you came into the VIP lane, it had already existed.
Yes, that's right.
But does it follow from your
running for a couple of weeks?
only by a couple of weeks, but does it follow from your previous answer that you would invent it again in the event of an emergency and the need to procure in an emergency?
Not in the form that it came to be. I don't think that the mere fact of being referred by a senior figure, in particular by a politician, is an adequate means of prioritisation.
So how would you, if you were reinventing it, how would you change it?
I wouldn't adopt a passive approach in the first place. I would proactively go out and look for people that can supply PPE.
Well, wouldn't that obviate the need for referrals at all?
Yes.
It would?
It would.
Okay, so I may have misunderstood your earlier answer, but you seemed to be defending the VIP lane as something that inevitably had to happen. You're now saying that if we were in the difficult, to put it mildly, circumstances of a pandemic again and the need to emergency procure,
Yep.
you would dispense with it altogether and have a different system in place.
I would take an approach which is closer to the one taken by the Ventilator Challenge. The Ventilator Challenge proactively went out and found people that they thought could design and build ventilators in a hurry.
And to the extent that it is harder to do that with more commodified products,
Yep.
that problem could be overcome by the use of IT, by triaging either automatically or semi-automatically with human involvement at one point or another. Is that right?
I wish I had as much faith in IT as you seem to have. I'm afraid 40 years in the industry have disabused me of that. I go back to evidence that you heard on the first day from your expert witness, and he talked about in his report certainly the use of structured data in order to obtain information from the market, sort that information, sift it, okay, this is the best offer in this particular information set, and process that. That requires a lot of work, and even so, it requires iterations. You wouldn't get something like that right first time. You'd probably even attempt it in the middle of a crisis.
Okay. Dr. Hall, I said I'd touch on the call to arms. Presumably you agree with previous witnesses that it didn't make matters any better.
It made matters a lot worse.
Yeah, all right. I want to take you briefly to an email that we've seen because you're its author.
Fine.
It's the one that you headed, I dream about this stuff. You may recall. Could we have INQ 000527547? Mm-hmm. And I really just want to ask you in relation to the first line, we have designed the least efficient process possible. You set out a little bit what you meant by that. Do you want to add anything to that?
I'll just give you 2 words of context if I can.
Yeah.
So I'd had a sleepless night worrying about this. And I think I woke up at 6 and typed this email. Initially, I was only going to send it to Max, who was my immediate superior within the team, for discussion. But at a late point, I blind copied Gareth as well. And I dream about this stuff is because it had kept me awake all night. We have designed the least efficient process possible. I'm possibly using a bit of hyperbole there. But all the same, I stand by that. I believe we had designed an inefficient process.
Okay.
Possibly for good reasons, because at the beginning of processing this enormous backlog of offers, we had a newly formed team that were not used to buying PPE. Many people, we didn't know them, they came from all over government, and we needed to segment, my colleagues needed to segment the task into smaller elements that could be quickly taught to new caseworkers and to new administrators.
In terms of, thank you very much, that can go down. In terms of how the process the VIP lane process might have been improved. You express this at paragraph 5.2 of your witness statement, where you say this: "It seemed to me that there was a need to differentiate more clearly between VIP offers which merited being given priority because they were viable and those which did not. I was also concerned to ensure that VIP leads which were unproductive were closed down quickly." So that concern did not translate into any change to the VIP process, did it?
It resulted, I mean, this was a discussion I had with Max, and Max did take action, as I've seen in some of his emails, in order to winnow down the stock of offers that he had in front of him.
But you're making a slightly different point, aren't you? That there are some VIP offers that come in that are no-hopers, and they should be stopped short instead of consuming resource.
And they were triaged out. So there was a triage process at the beginning of the high priority lane process that did take away people who were not offering sufficient quantity, people who were offering the wrong product.
So you would say that the concern that you were expressing was actioned?
Yes, I believe it was.
All right. I want to move on now to some of the examples of offers that you dealt with. Some of those offers came to you via Lord Feldman, didn't they?
Yes, that's right.
And can you just briefly, we'll be hearing from Lord Feldman himself, what was Lord Feldman's role in relation to the VIP lane?
In relation to the PPE acquisition process more generally, I understand he had been appointed and had near enough quasi-ministerial status, appointed into the Department for Health and Social Care to help Lord James Bethell with this particular task.
He referred 3 offers to you that resulted in contracts, didn't he? SG Recruitment, Maxima and Skinny Dip.
Yes.
I'm going to just take you relatively briefly to 2 of those. I think probably the swiftest way to deal with this is by reference to your witness statement, which I hope can be brought up. It's INQ 000536369. We're looking at page 17 and paragraph 6.12. You say at 6.12, in some cases I was unaware at the time that the supplier had any link to the Conservative Party, while in others Lord Feldman made the connection explicit. As far as you can tell, why was that connection made explicit? Was it relevant?
I believe it was Lord Feldman's way of saying that he had some personal, well, in this particular case, he had knowledge of or knew Lord Chadlington, and as a consequence, he believed that this company was credible, was not merely opportunistically trying to find an opportunity.
And you say something to that effect a little lower down. Lord Feldman also informed me that Stuart Marks was formerly Northern Treasurer of the Conservative Party. This I took to be Lord Feldman's way of saying that he knew Mr. Marks personally and could vouch for him.
And I take it you'll put those questions to Lord Feldman, because I don't pretend to be in his head.
No, of course, but I'm asking you, yes, you're quite right, and yes, I will. But the reason I draw it to your attention is I want to know how that, if at all, affected your handling of the offer.
That what affected my handling of the offer was not the connection to the Conservative Party. What affected my handling of the offer was that Lord Feldman had some confidence that the counterparty was credible.
Are you aware of whether or not Lord Feldman conducted any due diligence or inspected or assessed the offer that he was referring in?
I think it's worth looking at the phrase due diligence, because it has a particular meaning for procurement professionals, and it really means assessing the economic and financial standing of a particular company. So did Lord Feldman formally undertake that level of due diligence? No, I doubt if he had the capability or the knowledge to do it.
Any form of assessment?
I believe he made some assessment of the credibility of offers that were made to him.
Mr.
Yes.
Rees-Williams' evidence this week was that, as far as he was aware, offers were simply referred in without scrutiny.
What he's referring to, and I was here when Gareth gave his evidence, what he was referring to was that many offers never actually crossed the desk of the minister who nominally referred them. Those offers were received by somebody in a private office, and the private office sent them on to, as directed, to a particular mailbox. Feldman is a different case. Yeah, Feldman did have a private office, but they didn't send the offers. Feldman sent the offers.
All right. In any event, in relation to this one, you noted that the due diligence position, I think this is towards the bottom of 612 perhaps, no, it's it's not there, but you noted, did you not, that the due diligence position of the initial offerer, SGH Global, was not straightforward as the company was registered in Jersey. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yeah. Consequently, fully transparent information was not available about its finances.
Not on a public website, for example.
And you raised concerns about the consequent counterparty risks and suggested that they needed to be mitigated before a contract could be awarded.
Yes.
As far as you're aware, you then went back, didn't you? These mitigations were detailed on a deal form when a further deal was agreed with a different company, SG Recruitment.
SG Recruitment is a subsidiary of SGH Global. And the reason that that particular subsidiary was put forward as a counterparty was that it was an existing supplier to the NHS and it was in a UK jurisdiction.
Yes.
So in many respects, it was easier for us to contract with that counterparty. But we would not contract with such a small counterparty on a valuable contract unless we had some other backing in the form of, for example, a parent company guarantee back to a larger entity.
The contract, as you rightly observed, was of a significant value. It was a £16.1 million contract for chemicals and plastic films.
I don't recall that, but I'm happy to take your...
Yeah, it comes from the DHSC table that we've looked at earlier today. There was to and fro before the contract was concluded, and it resulted in a subsidiary as co-contractor rather than the initial offeror, didn't it?
It's not a co-contractor, I'm afraid.
Co-party.
It's the counterparty for the DHSC.
Was this level of iteration or back and forth available to an offerer outside of the VIP lane?
Well, certainly changing counterparties took place for other deals than just deals that are in the VIP lane.
So is your evidence that the connection to Lord Feldman or to Stuart Marks placed the offerer at no advantage in terms of negotiating an alternative solution to the original offer?
No, I don't believe so.
All right. Let's move on to Paper Straw Drinking Company. Could we have INQ 000513411, which is the witness statement of Mr. Stuart Marks? We just situate ourselves in paragraph 1. He says, I was also Northern Treasurer for the Conservative Party. At paragraph 3, below that, I was approached by a friend in our local community who in turn had a close friend called Jonathan Salem. Paragraph 6, I knew him from his role as Conservative Party chairman. And then finally 7 and 8, I offered to email Lord Dayton. Did you have any involvement with Lord Dayton through the VIP lane? Dr.
Yes.
Hall? Yes? On a similar basis to Lord Feldman?
It's a different kind of relationship. When Dayton was deeply involved in operational matters because he was put in charge of the PPE buy operation.
I offered to email Lord Dayton to see if there was, if anything he could do. it seemed that there was nothing to lose by going back to him and at least asking. And then finally, one of the Conservative Party donors, Mr. Agutson, runs a very large PPE manufacturing business in Manchester. He asked me whether I knew Lord Dayton and he was experiencing difficulties with his factory. I told him I did, and he was asked whether I would act as a messenger and deliver an email to him, which I did, and the email is attached. So, similar question. Dr. Hall, you say that a connection to the Conservative Party offered suppliers no advantage over other suppliers in securing procurement contracts.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely confident of that.
Let's turn to Skinny Dip, please. And INQ 000560757. This is a short statement of Lord Lee of Hurley. Paragraph 1 describes himself as a Tory backbench peer and senior treasurer of the Conservative Party. In view of my perceived relationship with the government and Lord Feldman, I was contacted in early 2020. In every case, he says, paragraph 5, I simply passed on the names with the information that they'd sent. I was not in a position to assess or advise on the credibility of any offer of help. So there is an example of a referral in that had no scrutiny applied to it. And that was quite commonplace, was it not, Dr. Hall?
Forgive me, my lady, I'm not quite sure what point Mr. Ward wants me to make.
Well, you answered earlier that there was some degree of scrutiny undertaken by those who referred in cases to the VIP lane.
Did he?
Well, he said that there was either, I thought this evidence was that there was...
I said that in many cases it was obvious that an offer had not actually crossed the desk of a minister because the email chain showed that the offer was handled by a private secretary in the private office. The offers that came from Lord Feldman came from Lord Feldman. They came from his DHSC address or another email address. So there's some reason to believe that Lord Feldman had looked at them and sent them on if he thought that there was some merit in them. But again, that's a question really you ought to put to Lord Feldman.
And I will. Final example, Mellor Designs.
Okay.
Could we go to INQ 0005366 This is your witness statement. Pages 18 to 19 and paragraphs 615 to 16. You just remind yourself of that. David Mellor of Mellor Designs had originally been introduced to the HPL via Michael Gove's office, as was noted in the list of HPL companies published by DHSC. I knew that David Mellor had a connection to the Conservative Party because I remembered his name in connection with newspaper stories in 2018. Mellor Designs was awarded several contracts for the supply of PPE, but I had no dealings with him or role in the award of those contracts before around the 1st of May, when Lord Feldman mentioned him to me in connection with a deal to supply a large quantity of type IIR masks, and I'd been pursuing with John Vincent and Leon Restaurants. Andrew, which is Lord Feldman, explained that he had discussed the deal with John Vincent and David Mellor, and that David Mellor had agreed to provide the counterparty, as John Vincent did not believe that it was appropriate for his restaurant business to front the deal. And then at 6:16, there was a problem about certification, wasn't there?
This is quite a technical problem, but would you like me to describe the issue?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the masks themselves were an acceptable product. They were certified. The challenge was that the masks needed to be marked with a CE mark before they could be exported from China. The Chinese government would not allow them to be so marked and to be exported without that mark. The mark could not be applied because there was no registered supplier of these medical devices in the UK. Mellor was intended to be the registered supplier of the devices. So, in other words, sponsoring the import of the devices into the UK. The time to register as a supplier with the MHRA was a matter of days. But at the point that that this communication came in relation to the deal for 2R masks, that registration had not taken place. And this was a blockage to us being able to obtain the 2R masks. So consequently, I was asked, I can't remember whether it was directly by Mellor or by somebody else connected with the deal, or indeed by Feldman himself, whether there was anything we could do. Actually, in retrospect, I believe it was Mellor. It was probably the only communication I had with him.
You say at towards the middle of your paragraph 616 that Lord Feldman's private secretary liaised directly with the MHRA to request that the derogation request receive their immediate attention.
Yes, that's right. In fact, but I do recall replying to Mellor saying that the MHRA is by statute an independent regulator, and there was nothing that I or any other official could do to force them to make to give an opinion one way or another. But this isn't actually the approval of the devices. The devices are acceptable. This is merely the registration of a particular company as essentially an approved importer. So I made a very gentle inquiry to the MHRA saying, what's happening with this? Is there any piece of information that's missing? We would really like to have these devices. And actually the matter was resolved, I believe, and would have been resolved without me communicating with the MHRA, because the approval came through within a day or so of that contact.
You would say that this is a matter that would have been resolved without a connection to Lord Feldman, without a connection to the Conservative Party?
In all likelihood, yes.
That you would have intervened even if it had not been a VIP referral?
Absolutely, because we wanted the masks.
At your paragraph 5.8, Dr. Hall, you say that you've been asked to address the question as to whether suppliers being processed through the HPL were given unequal treatment compared to those coming through the PPE, the buy-sell.
Yep.
And you say, I recognise that this process had the potential to lead to unequal treatment, as defined by the public contract regulations, but this was not so apparent to me at the time.
Yes.
You're not seeking, are you, to go behind the finding of the High Court that there was unequal treatment?
No, not at all. But we're talking about a period, probably, 18 months before that finding came down. And you must remember the circumstances that we were in at the beginning of the pandemic. So we're moving from a situation where pretty well all requirements are competed to a situation where we're making extensive use of Regulation 32. I had never used Regulation 32. I had never made a direct award in my time in the civil service, or indeed acting as a consultant to the civil service. Regulation 32 is very rare. There's practically no case law in relation to Regulation 32. So we didn't have a strong set of determinations that we could rely on to say this is what you can do, this is what you can't do under Regulation 32. We knew we could make direct awards. But for example, it's not a competitive situation. We're not running a competition. So really, does the particular consideration of equal treatment even come into bear?
Dr. Hall, it's not quite right that you wrote this in January of this year. This is your witness evidence.
Correct.
And the reason for my question was that it's your rather odd use of language. I recognise that this process had the potential to lead to unequal treatment. We now know that it did so.
It led to unequal treatment as found by the Justice O'Driscoll. Yes.
O'Farrell, yes.
O'Farrell, I beg your pardon.
You do, within your witness evidence, 516 to 517 and page 13, offer an alternative, don't you? And you started to discuss that earlier. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think there's some other considerations to bring into bear. There's been some discussion about the call to arms and when it happened and quite in what form it happened. Whether there's an explicit call to arms or not, a minister standing up on television saying, please send us your offers. A very, very large number of unsolicited offers of help, of product, had been received by Department of Health, by SCCL, by my own office in the GCCO, by CCS, because I believe public were motivated to help, businesses were motivated to help, and lo and behold, a lot of businesses found they had to diversify because their existing business was gone. So whatever solution we come to, there's got to be a way of doing something with those offers. In addition, people contacted their MPs saying, I want to help. People contacted politicians saying, I've got this offer. And there's got to be some way of dealing with those. I don't have a magic bullet for dealing with those, but both of them are challenges that need to be addressed in a similar situation. I don't believe receiving offers through either of those routes is the most efficient way to obtain these emergency goods. I do strongly believe that a proactive approach to potential suppliers in the market would have been a different way of doing this and possibly more efficient.
Can I take it from that answer, which you gave earlier, but you've now reinforced, that you didn't consider that there was anything inherently more credible or more promising about offers that arrived as a result of referrals into the VIP lane?
I heard Max's evidence earlier, and I share his feelings about the VIP lane in many respects. Initially, I too was sceptical, and I think I've reflected that in my evidence and in some of the emails I wrote at the time. So what are we doing here? Is this just a matter of political handling? Is this genuinely going to lead to what we really wanted, which was large volumes of useful PPE? Because I've got relatives in the NHS. Max didn't mention it, but he's got relatives in the NHS. We're all incredibly motivated to try and get PPE to the front line. And I didn't want to be involved in this matter if it was just a case of reassuring some politicians that everything possible was being done. I wanted to get PPE to the front line. And as a consequence of that, I tried to make the process more efficient. I did some of the other things that I've described in my witness statement.
So like Mr. Canduff, you started sceptical.
Yep.
You grew increasingly convinced that the VIP lane was a source of promising or inherently more credible offers.
Well, I can demonstrate that. Within a matter of days, I was talking to the most senior executive in the UK for Amazon, which I believed was a credible route to obtaining large volumes of PPE. And we did obtain some PPE from Amazon, perhaps a little bit less than we would have liked to.
So you have individual cases that you can cite.
Yes.
It's what one would describe as anecdotal evidence. The inquiry has assembled more data than that. I mean, I appreciate that you were in the thick of it. And I showed, you may have followed it, Mr. Canduff a number of graphics
Yes.
relating to performance and due diligence.
Yes.
Would you like an opportunity to comment on those as well?
I very much like that opportunity.
All right, let's do that now. The first is at INQ 000475005 and page 1. And this is produced on the basis of witness statements from 36 referrers, of which 2/3 responded.
Yep.
And amongst those who did respond, 67 indicated that there had been no due diligence, and you explained what you understand to be meant by due diligence.
67%, yes, roughly
Yeah.
2/3. But I'm in this sample. I'm one of these referrers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're not a referrer.
I did refer, yes. I referred one company into the high priority lane, and I enabled the referral of another.
Okay, what was your experience? Did you undertake any?
Did I undertake formal financial due diligence? No, because there was another team to do that. Did I talk to the supplier? Did I talk to people who knew the supplier? Did I investigate whether the supplier was had the right kind of experience to provide the kind of product that we're looking at? Yes, I did. And thus, I made the referral because I thought the offer was credible.
Okay. Did you answer the questionnaire from the caseworker side as well?
Yes, I did.
Well, you may be in an unusual position in the sense of being able to help us from both ends of the telescope. We'll move on to that. But in addition to the due diligence figures, there are performance figures, which you may have seen.
Yes.
Within the same period, how do HPL versus non-HPL contracts stand up to the test of performance?
I think the figures you showed yesterday suggest that 50% of HPL figures had some issues.
55%.
HPL contracts, 55% of HPL contracts had some issues, and I believe it's something like 37%.
39.
Thank you. And you may have the figures in front of you, but I don't. So I also heard Jonathan Marin explain how those figures come about and how you dig underneath them. So a performance issue might be that there's one gown missing in a shipment of several 100,000. It might be that there's a piece of documentation missing. It might just be that the inspectors from the MHRE at Daventry are in some way cautious about the shipment and decide to put it into quarantine.
It might be, of course, but all of those possibilities would apply equally to HPL and non-HPL.
Yes, and I heard you make that argument.
And what's your response to that?
You'd have to look at the detail. Mr. Marin said that roughly 20 contracts from both the HPL set and the non-HPL set fall into this category. And I know one, for example, that did fall into this category because I was involved in working it. So we haven't discussed this yet, but maybe you're going to come to it. There's a referral from a gentleman called Mr. Farha, who sold us £135,000 worth of gowns.
I will, not with you, I hope you're not disappointed, but with a future witness.
By all means. So Mr. Farha bought these gowns in good faith, 10,000 gowns. We shipped them from China. They turn up in Daventry. They're inspected. We told Mr. Farha we're only going to pay him on satisfactory inspection, and they didn't pass inspection because they didn't conform and have the right documentation. It's £135,000 in a £13 billion programme. So I think you've got to dig underneath those figures and get some sense of proportionality.
Of course, it's a crude analysis, but it is an analysis that is equally crude in the HPL case and the non-HPL case.
I'm afraid I don't accept that argument. I think in order to have something which is of value to Milady, you would have to look at more detail than that.
Right. You've made clear that your own view is that speed within the process is advantageous if you are about the business of trying to secure a contract.
Yes.
Yeah. And in fact, that was made all the more so by internal guidance to say anything over 2 weeks, don't spend further time on it, move on to others.
I'd clarify that if I can. I think that internal guidance says if it's anything over 2 weeks, revalidate the offer, which sounds to me to be sound advice.
Okay, let's have a look at it then. INQ 0000477 274. Second page, please. An opportunity should only be progressed if the offer is less than 2 weeks old. Offers more than 2 weeks old are generally not credible in the credit market, should not be progressed unless you have expressly confirmed that the caseworker that they remain valid.
Yes.
So where do we see that if they're more than 2 weeks old, you should revalidate them?
That's what the last clause means. You should have expressly confirmed with the caseworker that they remain valid.
Well, is it every single one that went beyond 2 weeks that was revalidated?
I can't attest to that because I would have to go back and look for the evidence of it. But that's what the instruction says. The instruction says if it's more than 2 weeks old, then go back to the caseworker who will contact the supplier and say, are you still making that offer on those terms?
All right, let's move on to the next graphic that was put to Mr. Canduff earlier today and upon which you may wish to comment. Chasing for updates.
Mm-hmm.
INQ 000475005, page 2. Again, you were part of this cohort.
Yes.
You were a referrer. Did you chase for updates?
No,
You'd have been chasing from one of your colleagues, presumably.
exactly.
Yeah. And we see that 61% did chase for updates. Are you able to comment? Would you have any sense of whether that...
It feels high. That wasn't my personal
It
experience.
feels high. And then we move on to the survey in which you did participate
Yes.
as a caseworker. INQ 000581860, pages 1 and 9. We start off there. Did referrers to the HPL contact you directly? I think we can conclude from what we've heard in your evidence already that you were one of those that said yes.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so you were one of the 8. And then let's move to the next, if we enlarge it slightly. We've already looked at that. There we go. Do you consider contracts in the HPL were treated differently through the process to contracts outside? Now, I'm going to, can we assume from the evidence you've given that you were one of those that said no?
No, you can't. I said yes.
You said yes, all right.
And the reason I said yes was because of the feedback issue. So my understanding was that, there was no one to refer back to. So there's nobody to feed back to in the non-HPL lane.
And
But I gave feedback at a request to people who had referred opportunities into the high priority lane because that was one of the purposes of having a high priority lane.
And that was the sole reason you said yes?
That was the sole reason I said yes.
You didn't consider that there was any speed advantage in a referral in or a...
There's some advantage in the speed to technical assurance, but I don't know whether we're going to come on to this. I recently wrote to the inquiry with some analysis I did on the relative processing speeds of different cases.
It wasn't part of my plan this afternoon.
As you wish, but it's part of my second witness statement, I believe.
Your evidence is that there was overall no speed advantage.
Well, if I may take the
Well,
inquiry's time.
I think Mr. Ward's opened the door, so do.
Okay, thank you. I did 2 different sets of analysis, and I should give a caveat that doing this kind of analysis is actually really quite difficult. It's not just a question of selecting a few cells on a spreadsheet and then putting in a formula. So I went back to original communications and original documentation in Mendix, for example, to try and do this analysis. I looked at 2 different times. The time between when a company was first made known to the PPE buy-sell and when it received a contract, by which I mean the purchase order. I took the purchase order date because that was the data set that I had. And the other piece of analysis I did was look at the time between the first acceptable offer and the time to contract, which is shorter, as you would expect, because it sometimes took time for companies to make an acceptable offer. And the first offer they made wasn't always acceptable. The time outside the high priority lane, again, from memory, or would it be helpful to look at my statement so I'm not inadvertently misleading the inquiry? I don't know if one of your colleagues can remind me what the paragraph number is, but
So this is the statement. Did you say second statement?
I believe it's in my second statement, but I could be wrong on that one.
Dated 16th January 2025.
5.10.
Then that must be the first statement.
No,
So-
yes, the second statement is.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Can we go on to the next page, please? That would be helpful. Okay, so I won't. You can read the process description there, but looking at the very bottom of the page, so the time from first contact to first purchase order for non-HPL cases is of the order of 6 weeks. The time for high priority lane cases, that time is of the order of 4 weeks. And there may be different explanations for that, but you must remember that there's a very large volume of opportunities which are made known to the Department for Health in March, in some from the earliest date from something like the 13th of March, and there was no one there to process them. There was no way of actually picking these up and investigating whether they were good, bad, or indifferent. So consequently, there's a couple of weeks, I can imagine, of backlog building up before the PPE cell was stood up properly and before it was in a position to process these cases. Whereas by definition, the high priority lane cases come in and there's Hannah Bolton ready to pick up the phone to talk to them. So yes, there's a difference in speed. But if we can go on to the next paragraph, please, which is on the following page. So this is in speed to contract. Yeah, and the data is quite interesting. So this is the time between the first acceptable offer and a contract. And for both streams, non-high priority lane and high priority lane, that's between 3 and 3.5 weeks. So once somebody has made a good offer, they get through the sausage machine and get their purchase order in roughly the same time. And I think that proves the contention proves. That supports the contention that my colleagues have made that these offers, once they were being handled, once they were being treated, were treated in a very, very, very similar way.
And you don't say that entry into the system, we saw a slide yesterday that identifies A plus B or C, A plus B being criteria that relate to the company
Yep.
or the offer, with C relating to VIP status. Entry into the system conferred any advantage in speed or otherwise?
It probably got you to technical assurance, the point of technical assurance more quickly. But there were some serious bottlenecks in technical assurance, in particular in April, and that's where the process got held up. You made one further inference from that particular piece of evidence, which was that there was no triage on the high priority lane offers, and that's just not true. There certainly was a triage on the high priority lane offers.
To put it into context, this 2-week period, the overall period of PPE procurement lasted for 100 days, didn't it?
Roughly.
Yeah. So we're looking at a 14-day period within a period of 100 days.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's not an insignificant period of time
No.
in that procurement window.
And in many cases, it would have made the non-high priority lane cases less likely to get to contract But I think it's also worth observing that inside that set of non-high priority lane cases, there are some of the things that Max Cairn-Duff talked to you about. And I hope this isn't being unserious, but one of mine that I mentioned in the witness statement was an offer for a recipe for chicken soup with proven antibacterial and antiviral properties. And that offer had to be picked up and looked at by somebody and then said thank you, but no thank you, in the same way that an offer of 10,000, 100,000, a million gowns had to be looked at.
All right.
So there's a really big qualitative difference between the offer set processed by the non-HPL stream and the HPL stream.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Have you said everything you wanted to about your analysis?
I have, thank you.
All right, thank you for that. Final point, but an important one, conversion rates.
Right.
Now, there was, I suppose, a degree of confusion about whether the conversion rate offers to contracts was a 10-fold rate of conversion or a 17-fold rate of confusion. I want to ask you some questions in the hope that you will be able to clarify that important point for us. All right. Can we start with Mr. Maron's witness statement and a table there? It's INQ 000528391. Table 11. There it is. Number of suppliers. HPL, the figure of 430 is given. Is that correct?
For these purposes, it's good enough. The matter of who is an HPL supplier and who is not an HPL supplier is, I'm afraid, like many other things, not a straightforward question to answer. So, generally speaking, we've used the existence of a case file in Mendix as a determinant of whether a supplier was or was not an HPL supplier. Now, as part of work for the inquiry, I had to look at, I must have done something bad in a previous life, look at these 430 cases. Yeah, and some of the 430 cases turn out to be state governments. And I don't believe we ever bought PPE from, example, another state. So that number is a close approximation.
But what I'm interested in for these purposes is, should it say suppliers or offers?
It should say suppliers.
It should.
That's correct. What it
Okay.
says there is correct.
And then, as against those, that number of suppliers, there are 51 contracts awarded. Number of suppliers awarded a contract.
I think it's actually 52.
Okay. If those figures are correct, that results in an 11.86% of potential suppliers being awarded a contract.
That's correct arithmetic, yes.
Yeah, being awarded at least one contract, because some
Yes.
suppliers were awarded multiple contracts.
As you can see from the figure below.
Yeah. Comparing that to the non-HPL, we have 15,194 potential suppliers, 173 suppliers awarded contracts, and that conversion rate is 1.13%,
Yes.
which results in a difference in conversion rate of approximately 10.5.
If you look at this by suppliers, yes, that's roughly.
If you look at it by suppliers.
Yes.
Now, can we now have up on the screen INQ 000477283, page 3? Oh, I've got it.
I take it you're looking at the second to bottom paragraph, is that right?
I am, indeed. It says a small proportion of offers, approximately 430 of the 24,000, were processed through a high priority referral route. So here the
I'm
same figure is
Forgive me, I'm
ascribed
not
to...
quite sure what the document is, but that's wrong.
Well, let's go to the top of it so that you're before you say it's wrong. It's a DHSE government website document
Right.
published in November 2021 and then updated in February of 2022.
Okay.
You say it contains an error.
Yes.
Yeah, let's go back to the error. To be clear, Dr. Hall, on the first day of this module, in opening, I presented a figure of a conversion rate of 17 based on this document being correct.
This document is incorrect.
It's incorrect.
Yes.
What should that say instead of 430 offers?
Around 2,200, and I think this is something we put in a corporate witness statement to you. So this will be our second corporate witness statement, which was submitted by Claire Gibbs, and I think I've got the paragraph number here. It's 3.93, and this says that around 2,200 individual case records exist in Mendix, and that means 2,200 offers.
Do you want to give that citation for the transcript?
Certainly. I don't know. Have I got the INQ number here? No, I don't. I'm afraid have the INQ number. Perhaps one of your colleagues could assist me. Oh, sorry, it's on the bottom of the page. So the INQ number is 000528389, and it's on pages 56 and 57.
Paragraph numbers?
3.93. It's all in one paragraph.
Great. All right. Look, thank you for that correction.
Okay. I'll just add one more thing if I can.
Please.
So we're talking about 10 to 1 measured by suppliers. If you look at it measured by offers, it's much nearer 3, 4, 5 to 1.
Okay.
I don't know if that's material or not, but certainly the proportion of offers accepted that came from the high priority lane as opposed to the non-high priority lane is different again.
In either event, there is a significant advantage in terms of conversion rate within the HPL compared to outside of it.
But I remind you of what's in the not HPL. In the not HPL is, as Max suggested, people offering to knit face masks for us, people offering to make scrubs, and although some of the offers in the HPL were less credible than others, there's nobody offering to knit face masks.
Thank you for that reminder. What's the answer to my question? In either event, there's a significant advantage.
There's an advantage, but the advantage accrues from the nature of the offers in the queue.
Final INQ number and question for you, please, Dr. Hall. INQ 000565970 and page 34. This is an analysis of how this translates in terms of the amount that was spent on PPE in and out of the high priority lane.
Yeah.
Does that concur approximately with what you had understood?
Well, these are probably better figures than the figures I had, because I assume these are Department of Health and Social Care figures. And remember, the Department for Health and Social Care has the contract data, which the Cabinet Office doesn't hold because we only did the front end of the process. We didn't do the back end of the process.
It shows that roughly, sorry, I beg your pardon.
So, and I take it this also excludes certain categories, because you do also need to look at how much came through the China buy route and how much came through the SCCL route. And I don't know whether this non-high priority lane contracts includes China buy or not.
But what we see here is a rough equivalence, high priority lane and non-high priority lane, and a slight, an approximate equivalent in expenditure as well.
All I can draw from this is a very significant value of contracts were let through the high priority lane. Right. Yes, that's correct.
Dr. Hall, though that concludes my questions for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there?
Just a couple more questions. Dr. Hall, Ms Mitchell, who's sitting that way?
I'm obliged. Dr Hall, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. This next question I'm going to ask you isn't a reflection on your business now, but perhaps a reflection on some evidence you gave earlier. You said that part of the issue was that you were working with a newly formed team that were not used to buying PPE.
Yep.
Now, in the last module, criticism was made by Dame Kate Bingham that, to put it bluntly, Business Nouse was not abundant in government staff, I think more broadly than people buying PPE. But it's a further criticism noted in Professor Dr Albert Sanchez-Griles in his report. How can this be changed to ensure that when the next pandemic comes, there are groups of people who are ready and understand how to buy PPE?
So there's a very, very small group of people in the UK that buy PPE for a living now, because frankly it's not a difficult thing to buy. It's a commodity. It's usually bought through wholesalers. I'm not trying to diminish the skill and application of my former colleagues who came from SCCL, but that's quite a small cohort, and all of those people worked in the PPE buy-sell, all of them. What we had to do was multiply that by 20. And of necessity, I mean, I'm a software engineer. Of necessity, you had to bring in people who did not have experience of buying PPE.
Would there be merit then in training people how to buy when markets are unstable?
I think there would certainly be merit in doing that and in exercising that. But I think it's actually insulting of someone to say that we didn't have business nous. We had, I don't know, 83% of the team are commercial professionals, most of whom have been through a formal accreditation system, like myself, to test that we knew what we were talking about and we knew how to deal with suppliers and buy things.
In fairness to Dame Kate, her observation, as I said in my statement, was more generally, I think, about government.
Okay.
It wasn't in relation to PPE. Moving on, Dr Hall, I wonder if I can ask you, we read in disclosure the prospect of using Amazon to streamline procurement of PPE, and I'm wondering, on behalf of the Scottish Code Bereaved, would this have outsourced a lot of work to businesses who could take the strain, or would there have been more specific problems with that, in your opinion?
Different problems. I think, I mean, outsourcing brings both advantages and disadvantages, and I have other colleagues who've written about that at length. And Amazon's wasn't strictly speaking an outsourcing proposal, but we did receive other proposals saying, why don't you give us this problem? You know, we'll take it away for you. We'll go out and find the suppliers, we'll source this for you, maybe do the logistics or maybe not. I think that would have created other but different problems, because then we would have had to manage the outsourcing contract and be a little bit that more remote from this highly critical activity. And it would have taken time to set that kind of arrangement up. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't have time. You know, the house was burning. We had to find a big enough fire hose to try and put the fire out. And consequently, I think what the Department of Health did, because it wasn't my decision, what the Department of Health did was the right thing to do.
Yeah. So you're saying that speed being of the essence, it would be better to keep it in-house than to try and...
I believe so, yes.
I'm obliged, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Very grateful. You've obviously been following our proceedings or done a lot of work preparing responses and things to the inquiry. If there's anything else that occurs to you that you wish to alert me to, please do. I'm entitled to take into account not just oral evidence, and do take into account written material, and I want to make sure that any findings I make are entirely fair. So if there's anything else, is there anything else immediately that you wanted to say that you haven't been asked?
I don't think I'll take up any more of your time today, my lady.
Well, if there is anything else, please let us know.
Thank you.
And thank you very much indeed for your help. I know what the feeling's like to be on a glide path to retirement and then COVID comes along. So thank you for coming off that path and for trying to help get the equipment that we needed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Very well. I shall return at 3:05.
All rise.
Mr. Sharma.
My lady, the next witness is Andrew Wood.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Wood, I hope you're warned that we may not get to you to the very end of the day.
No, it's fine, thank you.
I'm sorry if we have kept you waiting.
That's okay.
Mr. Wood, would you please confirm your name to the inquiry?
My full name is Andrew David Wood.
Mr. Wood, you have provided the inquiry with a witness statement. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
Yes.
Mr. Wood, to start, if I may, with your background, you've worked in commercial procurement since 1993, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And on the 24th of February of 2020, you joined the complex transactions team.
I did, yeah, 20 days before we were deployed onto PPE.
You were the Deputy Director, a commercial specialist, part of the government commercial function in the Cabinet Office. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
The inquiry has heard today and yesterday about the experiences of those within the PPE cell engaged in procurement of PPE. In your witness statement, you describe it as one of the most frenetic and stressful period of the careers of those you were working with. Would you be able to expand a little bit upon that?
Yeah, of course. As you've heard it already in some of the witness evidence, commercial work is normally quite painstaking. It takes time to run through a commercial process, and the outcome of it isn't linked to saving lives. Obviously, in this environment, by the time that we were called in to help DHSC on this assignment, we were already in a bad place as a country, which we quickly learned. So there was immense pressure. I think all the team felt that it was an immense privilege to do the work because we see that it was important to the country and to frontline workers. So yeah, it was a very strange, unusual environment that we had to get really focused on really quickly.
If I can take you forward a little bit in the chronology to a moment on the 21st of March 2020, when you describe in your witness statement arriving at Skipton House and you were given a briefing. Could you please recount the content of that briefing?
Yeah, sure. I immediately met Emily Lawson, Dr. Emily Lawson, who made me a cup of tea, which was very nice. And then she proceeded to tell me the situation that we were in terms of SCCL had already had the conversations around whether they could cope with the crisis, the fact that we would be using DHSC's procurement function, but we needed to set up a completely new cell from scratch. She also explained that at that time, we didn't know how much PPE we wanted or needed. So the instruction was we need to buy as much as we possibly can. I was also introduced to the team that were already on the phone with Beijing Embassy, who'd already started a week or so before, I believe. I met Lord James Bethell, and you know, he just asked if there was any help that he needed, to let him know, and he would make things happen. I met the former CEO of the NHS, I believe Simon Stevenson. And I think my impression was, you know, I could see it in their eyes and their body language. It was very professional, but they were very worried, and there was an immediate urgency. And the next thing that I did to just add to that briefing, if you like, was to request Emily's office to call Jin Sahota, the CEO of SCCL, who happened to live in London, which is where we were having our meetings. And he immediately came into the Skipton House, and we got in front of a flip chart, and he sketched out for me exactly how SCCL, I say exactly, but broadly how SCCL is organised, the fact that they needed to focus on everything else apart from PPE because the healthcare system needed them to do so and it was clogging it up, and that we would need to set up a completely new supply chain. Importantly, that their existing suppliers were, very, very low on stock. They'd already been, I'm trying to think of the word. They were empty of stock as well.
And so your instruction was you had to buy as much PPE as you possibly could. Is that
At that
fair?
time, that was the initial instruction, yeah.
If I were to describe you as very much at the coalface of the PPE buying effort, would that be a fair description of your work?
There were many coal faces. My coal face was, and I've described it in my statement, which you've seen, obviously, my role was to oversee the setting up of the PPE buy cell in a very short period of time, to quickly learn and adapt to the circumstances we were in. I mean, I had those few initial facts from that briefing, but we found out new things every day. And also to be the link between the buying part of the parallel supply chain with the other elements. So Emily was my client, and she was the lead along with Jonathan and later Lord Dighton. But I was that kind of interface, which I occasionally shared with my colleagues if I was on a day off, which was quite rare for all of us. That was one cold face that I was on. But my caseworkers in the different areas, as I'm sure we'll go into, were very much at the cold face with the suppliers.
You describe in your witness statement the organisation and the reorganisation of the PPE cell during the course of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And that the cell was trying to constantly learn and adapt about the things that it was experiencing.
Yeah, would you like me to talk about that for a bit?
Yes, please.
So when we first turned up, there were already a few hundred offers that had come in via various emails that I know you've already heard about. And SCCL also passed a big spreadsheet over to us. We literally started with Post-it notes, within minutes of designing a process of how we were going to meet immediate needs. And I have seen the expert report, which talks about having different types of approaches to this and different structures, etc. And I think for me, this wasn't an either or. We would have to do both. There was an immediate need that we had to meet. There were offers sitting there. Some of them, as Chris said earlier, had been sitting there for a couple of weeks. We needed to get a team on the phones, on the emails immediately. It was tough. It was tough. And obviously then we had to find our interfaces across the rest of the programme. Where were we going to dock into the move part of the team in terms of logistics, etc. The technical due diligence, we didn't have that expertise. So there are a number of reasons why we had to do that, but at the same time, we were thinking about going to and I think you've heard some of this terminology, and apologies for the terminology, into a product-based category structure. And I think there's correspondence that kind of backs up that I think around the 9th of April, we were already building that into our strategy.
And so just pause there for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
So the 21st of March is the day that you received the briefing.
I had an email, I think, on the 20th, and I had a brief discussion with a gentleman in DHSC, but actually the 21st was the day that myself and 2 or 3 other colleagues actually turned up at Skipton House and met Emily and the rest of the kind of management team.
And you describe considering going to a category approach as early as the 9th of April.
Yeah, so amongst ourselves, there was a member of the CTT who was part of that initial team, and she was responsible for the organisation, for going out across government, across the government commercial function to find resources, and also to pull in people to support us on building systems, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Her and I were discussing that already. And then also another colleague from CTT came in excuse me, and his role was to pull together the strategy. So while I was kind of overseeing it, Joe was focusing on organisation, structure, IT, plus I'm sure other things, and Rob Nixon was called in to specifically work on strategy in parallel to us. So it wasn't an either or. It wasn't, this is going to be the best process. We knew that. It was, we've got to do something now because we're running out of PPE. We're kind of, I think...
So forgive me if I interrupt.
Yeah.
You were at the same time in your team, you're frantically trying to call man the lines for PPE, and at the same time as doing that, you are designing and setting up a system for that to be undertaken on an enormous scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from the 21st of March to the 9th of April, that's just a few days. That's maybe, 2 and a bit weeks. So our initial focus was, we've got to get this up and out of the ground really quickly. But we know that this isn't the way this should be done. And there was reasons why we could not do that straight away. We had to deal with what was in front of us and to start to place orders basically for PPE. But at the same time, we started designing a system that we were ready with agreement with DHSC to implement from the end of June onwards.
You describe in your witness statement, and you have also this afternoon, the pace at which events were progressing. You describe the pressure which you and your team were under. And you also set out, just as an indication of the volume of work which you were involved in, a figure about the number of emails that you received in just 2 months.
Yeah, and I'm sure I wasn't alone in this, but just me personally, I think I received 6,500 emails in 2 months. And also in my statement, I've mentioned that I had to get a couple of people, colleagues from Gareth's office, to help man my inbox because I couldn't cope with that, obviously. Yeah, so it was frenetic is the right word. It was a privilege, but it was also very high pressure. And yeah, we had to build the aeroplane as we were flying it.
Although you have experience in commercial procurement, did you have, prior to the pandemic, any experience in the procurement of PPE or other medical equipment at all?
Not specifically, no. I was thinking back across my career of the closest I've come is kind of plastics, food products, when I was working at Tesco for 9 to 10 years. But the preciseness of PPE, I mean, I've heard a lot of people describe it as a commodity, and we kind of call it a commodity, but I think that does a slight disrespect to the PPE sector in the industry. It's a very, very precise industry in terms of certification, you know, the investment required to build PPE and to manufacture PPE is a heavy investment. Some products are simpler than others, but some of them are very high investment. So yeah, it's a very exacting product, and you know, we wanted to deliver equivalence from new suppliers to the front line. That was our job. So that was a lot of pressure in itself to get that right, because you know that's somebody's relative working on the front line, whether they're in a hospital or whether they're in a social care setting. That was a big responsibility for us.
You describe, if I may say so, in vivid detail, an example of sitting up late at night reading technical guidance about PPE. Could you please take the inquiry through that and how that came about and why you were doing that?
Yes, of course. So we'd received the specifications from SCCL, which we gratefully received, and they came through quickly. And these were the specifications that the NHS was using. So I decided in my own time, sort of during the night, to go online and to find specific documentation around some of these products. So I looked at the FFP3 mask, which was a very important piece of kit for all of us during the pandemic. And I read the HSE report, which was, you know, quite a few pages. It talked about the need to certify manufacturers, the need to have sampling and testing and retesting and visiting factories. So it just gave me an idea of kind of what I thought I was starting to understand, which was how precise some of this kit is. You know, aprons slightly different, gowns very precise, different types. So yeah, I was trying to give myself that insight at midnight at home while I was trying to manage the team.
And you land in the evidence that you've just given, one of the crucial differences between procuring items such as PPE in an emergency and procuring it when you're not in an emergency.
Yeah.
And that's the ability to see exactly what it is that you're buying.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about the job that we do is we get to become kind of experts in what we buy, and so we learn lots of different subjects. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to do that here. We didn't have time to become experts. We didn't have time to get to know the market, to speak to customers and end users. We didn't get time to visit factories. In fact, we'll come on to that later, I think, but we couldn't move anywhere. So it was, that was a big problem, particularly on such a crucial product that was keeping our people safe.
If I may turn to, please, some of the general problems which you have laid out in your witness statement about the procurement effort.
Yeah.
And of course, you set out in some detail the areas in which you consider that the UK succeeded and your team succeeded. But if I may turn to the problems with you.
Sure.
What were the principal, I think you described them as disablers,
Yeah.
within the system that had been established and within the expertise which was available to you and with the technology that you were confronted with?
Yeah. So there's a list in my statement, which I'll just pick out a few. So one I've recently just mentioned about travel bans. We wanted to be on the ground wherever this stuff was being produced, wherever it's being manufactured. We wanted to look at the stock, build relationships with the suppliers. Luckily, we've got a fantastic FCDO, as it's now called, and DIT teams who were out there doing some of that for us, but with different eyes. So we couldn't travel around. There were many products that were had export bans on them. I think around the 6th of April, we received a letter from 3M, who's one of the big manufacturers and an existing supplier of masks, that President Trump in his first term had basically banned 3M from selling any stock to anybody else, and it couldn't move around. It just had to go to the US.
So you were confronted, if I may say so, and put it in these terms, with the fact that it was difficult, if not impossible, to visit the locations in which PPE was being manufactured. And then around the world, there were export controls being imposed on PPE, which was being received into the United Kingdom.
Exactly, yes. Those export bans also had an impact on our make team, who were trying to get certain materials that were made in certain countries to British manufacturers to produce, for instance, gowns. So they had a very broad effect on the effort.
If I may turn, please, to a different subject, which is the call to arms.
Yeah.
A number of witnesses have described the problems which the call to arms created, and in your evidence, you describe it in these terms. It's at paragraph 12.7 on your statement. We don't need to bring it up.
Yeah.
The call to arms was not a commercial decision. It gave us a huge problem of trying to assess an avalanche of offers. And it's this point I want to deal with you here today with. It's government does not have due diligence in a box. What does that mean? What did you mean by government not having due diligence in a box?
Specifically on that point, I think some of your witnesses have described the normal processes in normal times of doing due diligence on suppliers and their products and their financial credibility. Is a detailed piece of work. We, through our initial 100 days as such, matured faster and faster with outside help. The size of and the quantity that we could undertake due diligence on these thousands of offers, and the particular due diligence in a box, it probably took a couple of weeks to set that up, and we didn't have that. We had to, the first offers were, I'm sure, caseworkers going on to, have they got a website? Are they on Companies House? Oh, they're not in the UK. Okay, so they're not on Companies House. So they would have to do that kind of very desktop due diligence. It wasn't until 2 weeks later of us working with the Cabinet Office team that we actually started to build that capability to cope with the number of offers, which obviously was very important in such a critical product.
And so did that mean that at the beginning of the response to the pandemic, correct me if I'm wrong, but does it mean that due diligence at the beginning of the response was likely to be worse than the due diligence as it progressed, or was it one of those processes that was developing? Explain to me, please.
Yeah, it wasn't mature. It wasn't mature. There are publicly accessible documentation, sources of data for doing due diligence on companies. There's quite a lot available. We're in a position where we had a few thousand offers at that time. Our processes for doing due diligence weren't drafted. We just literally walked through the door. And grateful for, as people started to arrive, particularly the MOD team or the DFE team, they started to develop processes while we were working with the market sourcing and suppliers team in the Cabinet Office to actually ramp up external support to help us do that in a much more deep and structured way.
And the way that you're describing it is a sort of iterative process in which, whereas at the beginning you didn't have access to due diligence, experts may come in from the Ministry of Defence and they could assist, and then from the Department for Education. And so expertise, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, was being brought in from other government departments.
Yes, it was. As we were building the team, we were bringing in accredited commercial people who had their own systems at their own home departments, and they were utilising those in the first instance so that we had something. But I think, as Chris said, the term due diligence, we need to just define a bit. It means so many things. The 8-step process, you could say, and I would call each one of those steps is due diligence. But then there are deeper dives on financials. There's a very deep dive on the product. And then ultimately at the back end, there's the contractual diligence as well.
And just to go back to the expression you use in your statement, due diligence in a box, what kind of due diligence are you referring to there?
There I'm specifically, I think, talking about the financial due diligence of potential suppliers.
And that's critical, isn't it? Because if
Absolutely.
the financial due diligence isn't there and isn't right, then the government and the public are exposed to contracting with parties who may become insolvent, who may not supply the equipment which has been paid for, and so on and so forth. Is that right?
Absolutely. You've talked about playbooks, I think, in some of the previous sessions. In the sourcing playbook, there is a policy and a tool to undertake a very thorough financial viability and resilience study. We weren't in a position to do that. That's one instance in terms of the numbers of offers and capability, but we did what we could. I think the other piece around this is we were presenting offers to the accounting officer of DHSC. We had to try and identify for them as many risks as we possibly could so that they could make an informed decision about whether to go ahead with a contract and a purchase order.
Mr. Wood, could I turn please to the subject of the high priority lane and its establishment? In your witness statement to the inquiry, you've said this, that what is now known as the high priority lane came about as an evolution of offers being received via email before the 21st of March 2020 from various parts of the government, usually at senior civil servant up to ministerial level. So is it your evidence that there wasn't a conscious choice to create the high priority lane?
I would say no. It was a reaction to a potential source of offers and market, if you like, that had opened up to us. Similarly, there was 150 plus staff in the Beijing embassy from FCDO and DIT who had opened up a market through their contacts. The MAG team obviously opened up a market of potential British manufacturers. The general opportunities lane was opening up potential markets. This was another example of that, and we were reacting to it. So I'll just hold there for a second if you've got further questions.
Yes, could I please bring up on the screen 534911? And if we could zoom in, please, to another action in the middle of the page. Just to place this in some context, forgive me, perhaps if we could zoom out so that we can have a look at the origin of this. This is a readout of a meeting with you, Mr. Wood, and Lord Agnew.
Yes.
And if we could zoom in, please, to the paragraph another action. Thank you. Another action I took was to advise Lord Agnew if we could fast-track ministerial seniors' emails regarding offers of help that they were sending through. You developed a public pro forma, a simple that automatically populates a database. And then you go on to set out that hot leads should be sent to Lord Agnew and yourself and others. What was happening in that meeting between you and Lord Agnew, and how does that relate to the high priority lane?
Sure, absolutely. So this was on the 25th of March, so this was my day 4. A meeting had been set up with myself from Lord Agnew's office. The meeting, I think, was for him to meet me. We'd never met, and to probably check me out and prod me a little bit. Is this guy up to it? Too early to tell at that point. One of the points he raised, well, I'll just go back. So after that meeting, I received a readout from his office straight away, and I was just about to send kind of my response back to him, and I'd sent this to some of my team to say, look, this is what I'm thinking of sending back. What do you think? And then in relation to the HPL, as it's now being termed, it's actually high priority appraisals, not lane. Sorry.
Forgive me, was that what it was called at the time?
No. From the 1st of April, roughly. So what Lord Agnew was asking me was, have you got enough people? How quickly can you respond to offers? He said, I've got business contacts. Some of my peers have got business contacts. They can help you. Is there a way that we can look at those offers more quickly, not more quickly than others, but can we look at those offers quickly and get back with an update? Even if it's a no, it's just we're kind of looking in at this box, we're seeing what's happening, and we need some feedback of where we are. So that was what that conversation was about. But I'm happy to provide more context if you need it.
What, in your view, was Lord Agnew saying and not saying when you had that conversation with him?
Yeah. It was about the response. He was saying, in my view, and I've never spoken to him about this since, but in my view and my interpretation of it, that this was about we need to respond to the offers quicker. We can't have a backlog building up. So how do we do that, and how can I help you, i.e. Lord Agnew, to do that? What he wasn't saying, in my view, is, right, I know loads of people that can provide PPE, and I'm going to send the contacts to you, and I'd like you to set up contracts with them really quickly. That absolutely wasn't what he was saying. This was about the response to those offers, because he felt that some of them were credible. The types of companies, the size of the companies, the potential international reach. He was trying to help, but he wanted to know that from our side, we had a team there, or we could build a team, bearing in mind this is the 25th of March, that could actually respond to them quickly. That was my understanding.
Thank you. Could we take that down? Turning to another subject, Mr. Wood, you've referred to the different lanes in which PPE was being procured. There was the new buy team, the UK make team, and the China buy team. And then, of course, there was SCCL, which had its own operation.
Yep.
Could we have up on the screen, please, INQ 534713. I just want to explore with you some comments which are in an email about the relationship between new buy and China buy and what the issues were between whether they were complementing each other or competing with each other. So if we could zoom in, please, to paragraph 2. Forgive me, let me just place this in context. This email chain is from Mr. Candiff. He sets out the content of the email beneath to you.
Yes.
And then at the top of the email chain, you reply that you're aligned. So that I can take it from that you're agreeing with what Mr. Candiff says in the email below.
Yes. At 11:04 p.m., I think. Oh,
Yes.
no, 5:11 p.m. So yeah, I can provide more information.
Could we please zoom into paragraph 2? It says the VIP cell and the wider sourcing cells are mostly dealing with intermediaries, many of whom are sourcing from the same factories our China team are already in contract with. There is clear risk of our disrupting our already contracted supply and outbidding ourselves for supply that we were already due to receive. I think the VIP and wider sourcing cells need to be much better aligned with the China team, with a clear and quick route to check if offers of PPE are potentially disruptive rather than additive. Yep. You agree with that statement of Mr. Candiff, and it was a concern of yours, wasn't it, that the actions of the new buy team, rather than complementing and sitting alongside the China buy team, could actually be in competition with them. Could you explain that a little further?
Yeah, absolutely. The number of PPE manufacturers in the world is not a huge number. And as we've already heard from previous witnesses, our existing supply chain was a mixture, but more intermediaries that the NHS was contracting with some manufacturers in there, but not many. As we looked across all of the lanes, the different buying streams that we had, I don't think there was like a huge PPE supply chain that we never knew about. Our job was to find new suppliers. We already had our existing suppliers. The difference with the China team was they were in country where the manufacturing was taking place. So I certainly, and we all saw this as a very important route for us, for both relationship perspective, but also getting close to whether it's a state-owned enterprise, an actual manufacturer, or an intermediary that was very close to the manufacturing. For this reason, this is around the 20th of April. So we just received our demand figures from the McKinsey model on, I think, the 16th or the 18th.
And forgive me, the McKinsey model is what was being used to predict,
Yes, sorry.
to predict the demand for PPE that would be coming from the NHS and social care sector.
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about when you refer to the McKinsey model.
Exactly that, yeah. It was a shift from buy as much as you can to product by product. Here is a 30-day and 90-day forecast of our demand, which was huge, as you can imagine. At this point, the China team, I was having discussions with the China team around, okay, great, you've done a few deals in the first few weeks, some of them before we even got here. Can we now start building strategic relationships with the suppliers, and can we start to share this demand? Because this demand demands attention, it's big. And we're competing against many other countries on the planet who were also in China. The other thing I was worried about was we were competing against ourselves, whether it was us competing against the central buy cell, competing inadvertently with an NHS trust that was talking to a supplier, a devolved administration talking to the same supplier, and worst of all, if we were competing between ourselves, as this comment suggests. So, what did we do? We did two things. We circulated around on a regular basis, this is the suppliers that we are dealing with on each lane. Please check for. So we're building up the knowledge across the different lanes and sharing across the lanes. But ultimately, at the end of April, we built the buying plan, which I can explain further if you like.
Well, but we won't deal with the buying plan for now, but is it right that up until the moment there was a buying plan, that the risk was there, that what was going on as everyone was scrambling to procure PPE was, as you describe, that even between competition within the UK, that we were pushing our own prices up because we were competing with the China buy lane, the new suppliers lane, and then, of course, the high priority lane?
The risk was always there. The main reason why the risk was there is that as a nation, we did not find a high level of information regarding the provenance of our PPE. So there could have been incidences where we were competing with each other, but we would never know, and still would never know, that we were competing because we were just dealing with an intermediary. Or there were the things that we could control were we actually talking to the same suppliers with this team and that team? Right, we need to start sharing our information, which is what we're talking about here.
My final set of questions, if I may, Mr. Wood. There is a section in your witness statement in which you describe, in fact, I wonder perhaps if we could bring it up on the screen. It's 540488. And it's page 34. Paragraph 7.8. Forgive me, I think it's a little bit lower down. That's it. Thank you. My mistake, Mr. Wood, it's 7.7.
Yeah.
You said, following my reviews of the numerous reports regarding PPE procurement, for me, the commercial and legal point is that it's not possible to apply all peacetime fair and equal treatment principles during an emergency procurement situation.
Yeah, I can talk about that.
Would you please explain what you mean by that?
Yes.
And in particular, is it that you don't think it was possible to comply with those principles in the emergency as it was at the time, or that you think that in all circumstances, in all emergencies, that it's simply unrealistic to comply with the principles you describe of fair and equal treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the particular instance that I was involved with, and still looking back, looking at the purist view, the legal view to ensure fairness, equal treatment and transparency, that's clear, but then applying it in this situation with a number of direct awards, a number of different ways that we were approaching the same market sometimes, or a different close to market, adjacent market, with the same requirement from UK as a whole. From any process that I've ever run in normal times, in peacetime, that would be a legal challenge straight away, because you just can't do that in peacetime. You can't talk to the market at different times and give them different information. You just can't do that. You've got to be completely equal. So I accept that the IANDA judgment, etc., those judgments that happened around the JRs and looking at that unequal treatment kind of ruling, I accept that, I understand it. What I've tried to get my head around is, if I was in this situation again, what would I do? And I can come on to that later. But this is kind of what I was talking about here is, I think as Chris Hall said, there isn't a lot of case law. There isn't a lot of detail, which the expert witness also said, there isn't a lot of detail about how to do this when you're enacting emergency procurement. And I wish there was.
Let me please perhaps ask my final question on this topic, and the final question I will ask you, which is that although it wasn't, at least in your mind, possible to do it at the time,
Yeah.
what is it that you think that would enable a system to be fair, equitable and transparent in the progress and award of contracts in a subsequent emergency?
Difficult to answer on the spot, but I'll try. But before I do that, can I just add one more thing to the previous answer in terms of what we could do and attempted to do? So, and you've heard this many times, and it's in my witness statement. We were fishing with many hooks outside the boat because we had a huge demand, we had very shallow supplier knowledge, and we didn't have a lot of time. So we had to fish with different hooks. We had to react to where the market could be found and go and find it and process it quickly. What we could do is we could introduce some level of separation of duties and standardisation in the process for how those offers were taken through to a potential contract, which we did do. So the entry point, I would say, on all of the lanes was unequal. I know that there's an extra element to the HPL, as it's now called, because of the political linkage and et cetera, but all of the lanes, I would say, are equally unequal, even within themselves. It's impossible for it not to be. So there were things that we did do to the best of our ability to try and level that playing field, but that was our challenge was the front end. So moving to your question of how could we do this in the future, there were some ideas that I thought the expert witness had, which were definitely worth looking into. So publishing, having ready to publish very quickly the requirement across a number of channels to industry of what the requirement was, what our minimum quantities were, being more upfront about that. The reason we couldn't be upfront about that is because we didn't know at the time. We didn't have that information, unfortunately. We did manage to do some of that later on, but we just didn't have the information. So, step one is to be prepared better in a number of ways for an incident like this. But second is, I think there are some learnings in terms of how we're communicating to the market as a whole, as opposed to on lots and lots of one-to-one basis.
Mr. Wood, thank you very much. Those are all the questions I have.
Mr. Weatherby, just there.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Wood, I'm going to ask you a very few questions on behalf of the COVID-bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And none of them are in any way meant to be critical of you, and they're about systems. And I just want to pick up where Mr. Sharma left off, really. You've been very clear this afternoon, but you were very clear in your statement also about what happened at the start. And I'll give some references, but I won't take you to the passages. But at 2.7 in your witness statement, you said, we had to build a buying function completely from scratch. This was a challenging environment to work in. And you also said that a bit later in your statement, 3.47H, and I quote, due to its design, SCCL is not set up for or equipped to deal with a crisis of this magnitude and so could not be scaled up to meet the demand. And their understanding of the market in terms of detailed product provenance was limited at the time. Mm-hmm. So, question, would you agree that this was a fundamental failure in the UK's PPE procurement abilities at the start of the pandemic?
It certainly didn't help.
Yes.
I'm sorry I'm not being more emphatic because I don't have the full information around this topic. But what I experienced at the time was there was, SCCL was set up to run a just-in-time process,
Yes.
and a highly efficient one. The level of knowledge was good up to a level, but in terms of deep understanding of the market, origins of different raw materials and products, etc., I think was lacking.
Yeah.
And we had to build that ourselves, which we did with some outside.
So the level of knowledge for a business as usual was good.
Yeah, I think that was very good and very efficient.
Okay. And what I've described as a fundamental failure, would you agree that whether it was a fundamental failure or it didn't help, this was a result of there being no central emergency procurement plan?
I think in some of my recommendations, which you've seen in my statement, and I was interviewed by the Boardman review team, and those have gone into the Boardman report as well. I definitely think we need to have a number of things that are ready to go. We've talked about due diligence in a box. We've talked about people having crisis training. We never had any crisis training. I'm sure there were some things that we could have learned if we were ready.
And I'm not trying to cut you short, but time is short.
Yep.
I was going to come to this in overview. You set those out in your statement at 12:15. And that's what I think you described as the need for a contingency plan.
Yep.
But the lack of an emergency procurement plan, did that come about partly because business as usual procurement was effectively devolved to the NHS and to providers, so they would seek their own PPE in business as usual through either SCCL or wholesalers? Those devolved rather than centralised. So there was therefore a lack of central planning. That's really what I'm asking you.
I mean, I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah.
What I've heard and seen so far through the inquiry is that DHSC did have some preparedness, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah, but no plan.
And the market then went into a very hot market and a very difficult market.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I'm not sure how much you could plan, but I think there are things we could do. In terms of being devolved, I'm not sure being devolved is the problem from a commercial perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's the flow of information, data between those parties that create.
I'm not suggesting, with respect, that it being devolved to the NHS or to SCCL is a bad idea in principle, or business as usual.
Yeah.
What I'm putting to you is that may be a reason why there wasn't central planning for an emergency.
Yeah, that's possible. I wouldn't know the answer to that.
And just finally on this point, just to complete it, that you described the buy-sell being, quote, thrown together, and that really is as a result of no planning. Nothing that you could rely on. So you were put in the invidious position of having to put something together from scratch, from the outset, in double quick time.
I can't say whether it's because of a lack of planning, because I don't work for DHSC and I'm not responsible for those plans. But, we had to throw an organisation together very, very quickly.
Do you think a solution would be to have a specialist PPE procurement team within DHSC or perhaps PHE, UXA, or an arm's length body, including SCCL, with the necessary experience, technical knowledge and market awareness that could be scaled up to respond to an emergency situation?
I think that sounds like it's in the right direction. I'm not familiar with what those organisations have already done since 5 years ago, or 3 years ago. But certainly that would be the direction of travel that sounds sensible.
Yeah. Different topic, and very quickly. You stated in your paragraph 313 that on the 23rd of March 2020, you asked for DHSC to set up a senior governance board to approve the process, strategy and operating model and consider setting price limits, but, and I quote, no such board was set up at this time. Can you just help us with what you envisaged? How would such a board have improved the procurement process?
I think it would have helped the accounting officer of DHSC, knowing that there had been further checks at a senior level, completely away from the team that was doing the doing, on the way to making a recommendation. We, as you can see, contributed to kind of living within that situation by setting up our clearance board. Yeah. Plus, we had lots of checks and balances along this process, which I agree was siloed, but I've tried to explain reasons why.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Dale, Mr. Dale's over there.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Wood, I ask questions on behalf of the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organizations, or FEMO. I note at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the urgency to secure adequate PPE was paramount. As you've noted in your statement, the immediate mandate was to acquire significant quantities of PPE to meet the escalating demands as the crisis unfolded. And this rapid procurement, driven by the need to save lives, no doubt posed unique challenges, particularly in balancing the imperative to act speedily with statutory obligations such as the public sector equality duty. So given your pivotal role in emergency procurement processes, FEMA would like your insights on the following questions. At paragraph 12.3 of your statement, you say, and I quote, "When I turned up at Skipton House on Saturday, the 21st of March, 2020, I was briefed quite literally to buy as much PPE as we possibly could because people were dying. Buying PPE is exactly what my quickly assembled, fantastically dedicated and hardworking team did with all of the commercial skills and experience we could muster. We therefore did buy PPE as instructed, and lots of it, too much it turns out, for reasons set out in relation to the demand that was set for us paragraph 3.6 above. We used our skills and drive to get that done with no experience of managing in such a crisis," end of quote. So my question is it fair to say that in PPE procurement, securing products that were considered the prototype in huge volumes was the predominant objective, even at the exclusion of consequential factors of equality and diversity, would you say?
Thank you for your question. The specifications that were given to us by DHSC were the specifications we delivered, tried to deliver, and bought to. We were not part of any decision-making process of what those specifications were, what special characteristics or considerations were in those specifications. They were the specifications I understood at the time that the NHS and SCCL were using in their contracts to buy PPE for the NHS. So I can only assume that they included some of the factors that you're talking about. But I hope I've answered your question.
Very well. We'll press on. At paragraph 7.7 of your statement, you say, and again I quote, "Following my reviews of the numerous reports regarding PPE procurement for me, the commercial and legal point is that it is not possible to apply all peacetime, fair and equal treatment principles during an emergency procurement situation. For example, it was not possible to run a supplier questionnaire or pre-qualification process or a tender exercise for every offer received at exactly the same time, giving all parties the same response time. The market was moving too fast, even for our fastest peacetime procurement process, end of quote. So question, can you confirm whether in your procurement work during the pandemic there was any regard paid to the public sector equality duty?
So that last bit you just said, if you don't mind, the public sector equality duty, could you just expand on that?
Yes, that's a public sector equality duty under the Equality Act. That is the requirement under law to have regard or consider issues of equality.
The only two things I can think of are that, the demand that we were given by product eventually and over a timescale was a aggregation of all demand from all parts of the NHS across the UK and social care. So within that, I get there must be a consideration to the equality side of things. From a specification perspective, I refer to my previous answer, which is this was the specification that the NHS was buying before the pandemic, and it was the specification we bought within the pandemic. So there was no change in terms of what we were asking suppliers to supply us with, which I presume over time is compliant with the Act that you're citing.
Did you understand yourself to be working under public emergency conditions?
Were we working in an emergency? Absolutely. Were we working on behalf of the public? Absolutely. In terms of we were supplying PPE to frontline workers, to social care workers who were interacting with the public.
Was this just your feeling, or was there a formal basis for you to think that you were in fact working under?
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought you might have meant something like that. I don't remember having any formal discussion with anyone regarding that. I was just doing my job on behalf of the Cabinet Office for DHSC.
You described in your evidence given to Mr. Sharma how you had to helicopter up to the technical aspects of PPE procurement work. And my question is this: what tools were available to you to ensure there were considerations regarding measurements and specifications arising from ethnicity?
Again, I refer back to my first answer, I'm afraid. The tool that we had and the piece of data that we needed was the specification, which was given to us by SCCL. I do remember that later on in that 100-day process, which I saw as a good sign, as we were planning ahead on our demand, we were thinking about all of the different variants of equipment, not necessarily based on ethnicity, but based on sizes and construction, etc. But apart from buying to the specification, that's all I can offer you, I'm afraid.
Very well. Next topic. As we reflect on the challenges and the learning outcomes from the pandemic response, particularly in PPE procurement, focus shifts to how we can do more in future pandemic preparedness. And in the lessons learned section of your statement, you list, by way of recommendation, the following: an advisory panel of expert customers to ensure procurement teams fully understand the product requirements and variants prior to purchasing stock, and a panel of regulatory decision makers with delegated authority and limited liability including technical compliance expertise, specialist manufacturing knowledge, and frontline NHS trust representation. And this, for the record, can be found at paragraphs 12.15, F and G. Would you agree and consider it beneficial for these panels to include ethnic minority healthcare workers?
I absolutely agree that the panel should be from a customer panel, if you're referring to that part. Normally in our commercial work, we swim kind of upstream to our customer so that we can really understand what it is they want us to buy and to sort of match them up with the market. The customer panel I'm talking about there should be representative of the customer base, which, you know, is all ethnicities.
Very well. And just to complete
No, I'm afraid
this,
you've had your time, Mr. Dale. I'm awfully
very
sorry.
well. I'll leave it at that.
you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Mr. Wood, we all know about how hard healthcare workers are working. Give me some idea of the kind of hours you and your team were working.
A short answer, milady, would be between 16 and 18 hours a day. So it was full on. And, you know, we weren't alone in that.
I appreciate an awful lot of people in lots of different fields, but I think it is important that people do understand. I've certainly got that impression from listening to your colleagues. Thank you very much indeed for all that you did during the pandemic and for all the help that you've given the inquiry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very well.
Lady.
10:30 Monday.
Yes.
Thank you.